I used to think the worst thing a mid-level employee could do was mess up the numbers in front of the executive board. I was wrong. The worst thing was falling asleep on the shoulder of the most powerful woman in the company during a commercial flight delayed by a snowstorm. And the part that made it worse was waking up to find a small, unmistakable smear of drool on the lapel of her expensive blazer. My name is Arthur Hayes. I'm 32. I work as a mid-level logistics coordinator at Meridian Global, a transportation and supply chain company headquartered in Chicago. The title sounds more important than it is. In practice, it means that if a container gets stuck at the port, if drivers walk off the job, if a warehouse scans the wrong SKU, if a client starts yelling, or if the reporting system runs late, people come looking for me. They want to know why the world doesn't simply run itself the way it's supposed to. I'm not poor enough to be desperate, but I've never been comfortable enough to stop counting. My mother died a little over a year ago after a long illness. After the funeral, I was left with a small apartment, an old car, a few boxes of keepsakes, and a stack of medical bills that kept arriving as if the disease itself still expected payment. From that point on, I lived on a schedule that barely allowed for breathing. Days were spent wrestling shipping data. Evenings went to inventory reports. Nights, I took on small consulting jobs for local businesses so I could chip away at the debt. I slept in short, broken pieces and woke up with burning eyes and the bitter taste of cheap coffee in the back of my throat. That morning, the alarm went off at 4:15. It didn't ring so much as explode on the nightstand. I reached for it, knocked a plastic cup onto the floor, and listened to the sound echo through an apartment that was dark, cold, and empty enough that I stood still for a few seconds, half afraid I might have woken someone. There was no one, just me. I dragged a hand across my face. The skin felt thin, like paper, and the inside of my skull ached with a dull, steady pressure. I couldn't remember if it was Thursday or Friday. The days had blurred into one long, gray stretch of spreadsheets, urgent calls, cold coffee, and microwave dinners. I turned on the coffee maker. It hissed like it was exhausted, too. I was supposed to fly to Seattle that day for the quarterly shareholder conference. I had the main logistics data on an external drive for the presentation. Because of security protocols, I had been approved for a rare first-class seat. It should have been a small stroke of luck. Instead, the weather in Chicago that morning was so bad, the airport looked like a refugee camp for people in suits. A November snowstorm had grounded private jets and thrown the commercial schedule into chaos. Travelers were stranded at every gate. I arrived just as the gate agent called the final boarding group. My laptop bag pulled hard at my shoulder. The shirt I had ironed in a hurry still had a soft crease at the collar. My eyes burned from 4 straight days of sleeping less than 3 hours a night. I stepped into the first-class cabin and checked my boarding pass. Seat 2A. Then I froze. Sitting in 2B, typing quickly on a tablet, was Margot Tennant, CEO and major shareholder of Meridian Global, the woman employees quietly called the Ice Machine. She was 42, known for being ruthless in meetings, capable of making a senior director sweat with a single question about the numbers. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal blazer, dark hair pulled into a tight knot, her face sharp and cold like office glass in winter. She did not fly commercial. She did not make small talk. She did not sit next to mid-level employees like me. Apparently, her private jet had been grounded by the same storm. I stood in the aisle too long. Margot looked up. Her pale blue eyes moved across my face, my inexpensive suit, the dark circles under my eyes, and stopped on the company badge clipped at my hip. She said, "Hayes, Logistics." Not a greeting. More like a system confirming a product code. I swallowed. "Yes, ma'am. Arthur Hayes." She shifted her knees slightly to the side. "Don't block the aisle, Hayes. You're holding up the line." I slid past her and dropped into the window seat. My heart was beating as if I had just been locked in a cage with a high-end predator. The plane pushed back. Wet snow slapped against the small window. I opened my laptop and tried to focus on the third-quarter delay figures. The screen was too bright. The numbers started to blur. I told myself I had to stay awake. I was sitting next to Margot Tennant. I would be presenting in front of her in less than 3 hours. I could not afford to look weak, slow, or unprofessional. But the human body has limits. The low, steady roar of the engines worked like a cruel lullaby. The first-class seat was softer than the chair in my cubicle by a wide margin. The exhaustion I had been shoving down for weeks rose up all at once, like floodwater. I pinched my thigh hard. Stay awake. I blinked. Stay awake. The plane shuddered through light turbulence. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes for 1 second to rest them. Just 1 second. Then the dark pulled me under. I didn't dream. I dropped straight into a deep, black, heavy sleep, as if someone had laid a sheet of lead across my chest. When I came to, the sound of the engines had changed. The plane was descending. My brain worked slowly, sorting pieces of sensation one at a time. The smell of expensive espresso. A faint trace of sandalwood. Soft wool against my cheek. A warmth that was both strange and terrifying. I opened my eyes. In front of me was the collar of Margot Tennant's charcoal blazer. My head was resting on her shoulder. For a few seconds, my soul left my body. I jerked upright so hard I cracked my forehead against the window frame. Oh, God! I pressed a hand to my head and turned toward her, face burning. Miss Tennant, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I haven't been sleeping. This is completely unprofessional. Margot didn't flinch. She didn't even look at me right away. She calmly brushed her shoulder, as if removing a small piece of lint from the surface of her empire. Then she turned her head. Her voice was flat, cold, and empty of feeling. You snored, Hayes. I wanted to open the emergency exit and throw myself into the clouds. I'm truly sorry. I'll pay for the dry cleaning. You slept for 2 hours. I went rigid. Margot looked back at her tablet. And there is a small amount of drool on my lapel. My face felt like it was on fire. Be quiet, Hayes. The flight attendant is staring at you. I sat as still as a corpse. She continued without looking at me. Review the third quarter numbers. You present in 40 minutes. No termination, no lecture, no threat. Just a cold sentence, sharp as a blade, reminding me that no matter how humiliating the moment had been, the company still needed the data. The conference in Seattle passed like a fever. I presented on pure instinct, answering questions about the Detroit warehouse delays, the proposed rail reroute, fuel costs, and weather risk. Margot sat at the head of the table and gave nothing away. She asked 2 questions sharp enough to nearly knock the air out of me, but I answered them. That night, I flew back to Chicago in economy. I spent the entire weekend waiting for an email from Human Resources. None came. Monday morning, I badged into the Meridian Global headquarters. The light turned to green. I let out a breath. Maybe I had survived. Then at 9:15, my desk phone rang. Claire's voice, Margot's executive assistant, came through the line. Mr. Hayes, Ms. Tennant would like to see you in her office at 9:30, floor 40. The call ended. I stared at the receiver. Floor 40 was the executive level. People from the 14th floor like me did not go up there unless they were being promoted or ceremonially executed by the corporation. Given the drool on the CEO's blazer, I knew which one was more likely. The executive elevator rose in complete silence. The floor numbers lit up one after another like a countdown to the end of my career. Floor 40 at Meridian Global did not feel like the rest of the company. On the lower floors, you heard printers, phones, hurried footsteps, and the quiet sound of people swallowing frustration with their coffee. Floor 40 was quiet. Too quiet. It smelled of leather, ozone, expensive wood, and a kind of invisible pressure that made you straighten your collar without thinking. Claire sat behind her desk, thin-rimmed glasses, expression that discouraged unnecessary words. She pointed toward the frosted glass door. I knocked. Margot's voice came through, even and calm. Come in. The CEO's office was large enough that my entire apartment could have fit inside it with room left over for a small conference table. Floor-to-ceiling glass looked out over the Chicago skyline. The desk held no family photos, no plants, no personal objects of any kind. Only screens, folders, and clean, cold lines. Margot stood near the windows with her back to me. Sit down. I sat in the low leather chair across from the desk and locked my hands together so she wouldn't see them shaking. She turned. She didn't sit behind the desk. She leaned against the edge of it, arms crossed, and looked at me. Your data on the Detroit delays was accurate. I blinked. I had prepared myself for a reprimand, not a performance review. She continued. But the proposal to shift freight to rail is too conservative. It reduces risk, but it costs time. I forced my mind back to work. Ma'am, rail is slower, but the weather is making the highway routes too unstable. Delivery variance is already at 10%. This quarter, consistency is cheaper than speed. Margot watched me. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. Then she asked, "Why are you so tired, Hayes?" The question changed direction so fast it felt like someone had yanked me by the collar. "I'm sorry?" Her voice dropped slightly. "I don't hire people who fall asleep from lack of control. I also don't like employees who look like they're surviving on caffeine and panic. You presented well, but on Friday, you looked like a corpse. You slept on the shoulder of someone who is essentially a stranger as if you hadn't seen a bed in a week. I'm asking again, why are you so tired?" My corporate instinct wanted to lie. I wanted to say I had simply overworked myself preparing for the conference. I wanted to turn exhaustion into proof of dedication. But looking into those pale blue eyes, I knew she would recognize the lie before it left my mouth. I said, "My mother died a little over a year ago." Her face didn't change, but something in her eyes paused. I kept going. "She was sick for a long time before that. I'm still paying the medical bills. I take extra consulting work at night. The Seattle project and the quarterly reports stacked on top of everything. I've been sleeping very little. Not enough. But the report still went out on time." I waited for her to tell me that personal life had nothing to do with performance. I waited for her to remind me that Meridian Global was not a charity. Instead, Margot looked down at the polished surface of the desk. When she looked up again, the ice was still there, but the light reflecting off it had shifted. "Who takes care of you when you fall apart?" I was quiet for a moment. The question was stranger than anything she had asked before. I answered, "No one." My voice sounded calmer than I felt. "I live alone. There's an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Gable, who sometimes brings soup if she thinks I look especially bad. But I'm not anyone's responsibility." Margot walked around behind the desk and pulled a folder toward herself. "My personnel file." She opened it. "The corporate machine is designed to grind people down, Hayes. It takes time, mind, health, and gives money in return. It doesn't care that your mother died, that the medical debt is still there, or whether you sleep." She looked at me. "But I hate inefficiency. A smart employee who can spot systemic risk yet is operating at 50% capacity because of exhaustion and debt is a waste of resources." I didn't know whether to feel insulted or grateful. Margot tapped a fingernail on the cover of the folder. "I'm reclassifying your position, effective immediately." I thought I had misheard. She continued in the same tone she might use reading a board resolution. "You are now Director of Regional Risk Management. I created the title 10 minutes ago. Salary increase of 30%. Flexible remote work. Access to Meridian's Platinum Executive Insurance Package. The company will also provide financial counseling support for the remaining medical debt." The air in the room suddenly felt too thin. I looked at the folder, then at her. "Why?" Margot answered smoothly. "Because your conservative approach in Detroit, while slow, prevented a much larger failure in the fourth quarter. Because a person who can still analyze risk at that level while nearly collapsing is someone I want focused on the company, not focused on surviving the next bill." Something hot rose in my chest, a mix of pride and bruised self-respect. I sat up straighter. "I didn't ask for pity, ma'am. What happened on the plane was my fault. I'll accept a write-up, a formal reprimand, or suspension. But I don't need charity." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Margot's voice turned sharp. "Ego is inefficient, Hayes." I went still. She continued. "Charity is writing a check for a gala so you can feel better about yourself. This is an investment. I'm buying your focus. When you can sleep, you'll catch the supply chain errors other directors miss. When medical debt isn't choking you, you'll think more clearly. When you're not losing 3 hours a day to commuting, you'll produce more value. Do you understand?" I wanted to argue. The words died in my throat. I thought of the stack of bills in the kitchen drawer. The nights I sat in front of a screen with eyes so raw I couldn't read the first line. The times I told myself I only needed to hold on for one more month. I asked very quietly, "If I sign, what do I owe you?" Margot looked at me without smiling. "Performance, honesty, and never sleep on my shoulder again without permission." I almost laughed from the tension, but my eyes felt hot. I took the pen. My hand shook as I signed my name. I didn't feel rescued. I felt like someone had pulled me out of a ditch just before the water rose over my head. The next 3 days felt like a hallucination. I worked from the small kitchen of my apartment, watching snow settle over the Chicago streets through the window. No crowded train, no frayed necktie, no pretending I was fine in the company restroom. I slept 4 uninterrupted hours for the first time in weeks. I drank water instead of old coffee. I rebuilt the entire Midwest distribution matrix from my kitchen table with a clarity I hadn't believed I still possessed. The results came quickly. My revised plan was projected to save Meridian several $1 million in shipping costs the following quarter. The guilt arrived at the same time. I knew the people still on the 14th floor were being ground down the same way I had been. I knew I had been pulled upward not because the system was fair, but because the moment I collapsed, the person sitting next to me happened to be the one with the power to change my trajectory. 2 weeks later, I returned to the office. I had a small glass office on the executive floor near Claire's desk. My name was printed on the door plate. Every time I looked at it, it still didn't feel real. One Tuesday evening, close to 7, as I was packing up to leave, a shadow fell across the doorway. I looked up. Margot stood there, tablet in one hand, black coat over her suit. She spoke without greeting. "Your Chicago Matrix." I straightened immediately. "Is there a problem?" "No." She studied me more carefully. The dark circles under my eyes had faded. My shirt was properly pressed. I looked slightly more like a functioning human being. "It's projected to save $4 million before the third quarter." I answered, "Thank you, ma'am." Margot remained in the doorway longer than necessary. The silence between us did not feel like the silence between a superior and a subordinate. It was more awkward than that. Then I realized something. She didn't know how to speak to another person when she wasn't issuing orders or dissecting numbers. Finally, she said, "Have a good evening, Hayes." She turned to leave. I called out before I could stop myself. "Ms. Tennant?" She stopped and glanced over her shoulder. I said, "Thank you." I meant every ounce of it. Margot didn't smile. She only nodded once and walked away down the long corridor, a solitary figure disappearing into the quiet wealth of the empire she had built. At that moment, I didn't yet know that the wall around her had already begun to crack. I only knew that for the first time I had seen the person standing behind the glass. Winter in Chicago slowly gave way to a gray, damp March. My life began to have a rhythm again. Not perfect, but a rhythm. I still worked hard, but I no longer felt like a man running from a fire. I could work from home when I needed deep focus. I could see a doctor without calculating which meal I would have to skip to cover the cost. I paid down part of my mother's medical debt. My small apartment was still old, but it no longer felt like a box waiting to collapse. The strange part was that I performed better than ever. When a port strike in Seattle threatened to choke the entire Pacific corridor, I stayed awake nearly 3 days rerouting freight through Vancouver and Oakland. I kept the company from a catastrophic wave of late deliveries. But during those same days, I also realized I was becoming the kind of machine Margot respected. I started answering emails at midnight, skipping meals, drinking black coffee instead of water, treating sleep like something that could be negotiated. One evening, Mrs. Gable stood at my apartment door with a container of chicken soup. She looked at my face and said, "You're starting to look like a corpse again, Arthur." I gave a tired smile. "I got promoted. Apparently the corpse now has a glass office." She didn't smile back. "Don't let people pull you out of one machine just so they can turn you into a better gear." That sentence stayed in my head for days. Then came the second Saturday in April. It should have been a quiet weekend. Instead, the logistics servers suffered a major failure. A portion of the routing data froze, the dashboards threw false alerts, and if it wasn't fixed before Monday, the entire Midwest reporting system would collapse. I had to go in. No choice. I arrived at the building at 8 in the morning carrying a paper bag with a sandwich, a few bottles of water, and a box of cookies Mrs. Gable had forced into my hands. She said if I was going to destroy myself inside a glass tower, I should at least chew something. Floor 40 on a weekend was almost empty. No phones, no heels clicking, no assistants murmuring into executives' ears. Only cold light through the glass walls and the steady breath of the air conditioning like a building that had gone to sleep. I went into my office, opened 3 screens, and dove into the problem. By nearly 1 in the afternoon, the crisis had stabilized. I stood up to get water, my head aching from staring at code and warning tables for too long. When I returned, Margot Tennant was standing in my office. No blazer, no corporate armor. She wore a gray cashmere sweater, dark jeans, and her hair was tied lower than usual. If not for the steel-straight posture and the familiar cold eyes, I might have thought she was just a woman who had wandered onto the wrong floor. She was looking at my desk. On it sat an open cookie box, sandwich wrapping paper, a water bottle, a few pages of handwritten notes, and an old wool scarf I kept beside the laptop because the air conditioning on floor 40 ran too cold. I stepped in quickly. "Ms. Tennant, I didn't know you would be here. I'm sorry if the desk is—" She raised one hand. "How are the servers?" "Stable again. I'm cross-checking the Detroit and Kansas City routing data." She looked at the screens, then at me. "Have you eaten?" I froze. "What?" "Simple question, Hayes." I glanced down at the half-eaten sandwich. "Half?" Margot looked at the cookie box. "Your lunch is half a sandwich and neighbor cookies?" I didn't understand why I felt embarrassed. Mrs. Gable is fairly insistent. Margot was silent for a second. "The one who brings soup?" I was surprised she remembered. "Yes." She looked around the small glass office, then said, "Go eat." "I still need to run the final checks." "The servers are stable. The data can wait 20 minutes. Your stomach, based on historical observation, is not managed correctly without intervention." I didn't know whether to argue or laugh. In the end, I picked up my coat. Because it was the weekend, the main cafeteria was closed. Margot called security to open the small kitchen on the 39th floor, where a few packaged salads, hot soup, and bread remained. We sat at a table by the window. It didn't feel like lunch with a boss. It also didn't feel like lunch with a friend. It sat in that strange middle ground where neither of us knew where to put our hands, our eyes, or the distance between us. Margot ate slowly, the way someone treats eating as body maintenance. I asked, "Do you usually come in on Saturdays?" She answered, "When it's necessary." "And today it was necessary?" She looked out the window. "The building is quieter on weekends." I understood the sentence more than she intended. I used to leave the kitchen light on all night, not because I needed the light, but because I couldn't stand how silent the apartment felt. I said, "Quiet isn't always comfortable." Margot turned toward me. Something very small moved in her eyes. "No." Just one word, but it carried weight. After lunch, we returned to the system. Margot didn't go back to her own office. She stood behind me reading error logs, asking precise questions, occasionally offering a comment that forced me to adjust my analysis. She didn't praise, she didn't encourage, but she stayed. Near 4 o'clock, the system was fully stable. I exhaled and leaned back in the chair. Margot looked at the final screen, then said, "Good." From her, that was the equivalent of a full speech of praise. I gave a tired smile. "Should I record that?" She looked at me. I thought I had crossed a line, but the corner of her mouth lifted very slightly. If I had blinked, I might have missed it. "Don't overplay small victories, Hayes." I smiled. When she turned to leave, I saw something else on her face. Exhaustion. Not the panicked kind I used to carry. The deeper kind that sits in the structure of a person who has been holding up a building from the inside for too long. I called after her. "Margot." Her name left my mouth before I could correct it to Ms. Tennant. She stopped. Both of us felt the boundary shift. I spoke more quietly. "You should go home and rest too." She didn't turn immediately. When she did, the ice on her face had returned, but it wasn't completely sealed. "I'm not very good at resting," I answered. I used to think I didn't have a choice either. She looked at me a second longer. "And now?" I said, "Now I know sometimes the choice is there. I just got used to not asking for it." Margot didn't reply. She walked toward her office. But that evening before I left, a message appeared on my screen from the CEO's private account. "Hayes, the servers are stable. Go home. If you're still here after 10 minutes, I'll consider it poor time management." Underneath was a second line. "Take the cookie box with you. Don't leave it for the executive floor ants." I read the message 3 times. Then I laughed out loud in the empty office. The wall hadn't only cracked, light was beginning to come through. December's arrived, cold enough that the Chicago River looked like a broken strip of gray metal. Inside the Meridian Global headquarters, the temperature stayed a perfect 70 degrees. The light was always even. The floors always clean, the glass always polished. But my life had changed. I was no longer the man who had fallen asleep on the CEO's shoulder because his body had simply run out of fuel. I had my own office on the 39th floor, a real title, a small team under me, and results no one could dismiss. I also had a strange distance with Margot Tennant. Not friendship in any ordinary sense. Not love, at least not a word I was ready to use yet. But between us ran a thread woven from things no one else understood. The flight, the humiliating smear of drool, the decision on the 40th floor, the Saturday lunch, the sharp messages that were no longer completely cold. On Christmas night, I left the office at 2 in the afternoon. I went home and cooked a small dinner for myself. Turkey roasted 2 hot, boxed mashed potatoes, green beans fried in a pan, and an apple pie from the store because I had no illusions about baking. Mrs. Gable knocked at 5 with another box of cookies and scolded me for setting the oven at 400 instead of 350. "It'll be dry as sandpaper, Arthur," I said. "I have gravy." "Gravy isn't magic." She went back to her apartment and left me with a lit kitchen and the smell of slightly burnt food. Around 7, while searching for the small gift I meant to send my cousin in Milwaukee, I remembered I had left it in the drawer of my desk at work. A plain box, nothing expensive, but if it missed Christmas, it would lose its point. I put on my coat and drove through streets that were nearly empty. The Meridian Global building on Christmas night looked like a block of ice standing in the middle of the city. The main lobby was darker than usual. Only one older security guard sat beside a decorated tree. I badged in at 7:40. I should have gone to the 39th floor, taken the gift, and left. Instead, without fully deciding to, I pressed 40. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe in the months since the flight I had learned that the silence on that floor was never truly peaceful. The elevator doors opened. Most of the executive floor was dark. Only a thin line of warm light spilled from under the frosted glass of the CEO's office. I stood still for a few seconds. I should have turned around. But the air felt heavy, the way it does just before a pressure valve fails. I walked to the door and knocked twice lightly. Margot's voice came through completely calm. "Come in, Hayes." She already knew it was me, probably from the security cameras. I opened the door. Margot was not behind her desk. She sat in a low leather chair near the windows, the city of Chicago glowing gold beneath a black sky behind her. She wore a black turtleneck and charcoal trousers. On the small table beside her stood a crystal glass with 2 fingers of amber whiskey. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from a few short nights. The kind that settles into a person who has held up an empire for 20 years and has just noticed there is no one standing inside it with her. I stayed near the door. "Merry Christmas, Ms. Tennant." She took a sip of the whiskey. "Is it? I'm not sure. The Tokyo market opens in 5 hours. What are you doing here? The systems are stable." "I left a gift in my desk. If I don't get it tonight, I'll have to explain to relatives that Santa had a logistics problem." Margot looked at me for a long time. Then she reached for a second crystal glass, poured scotch from a heavy decanter, and set it on the edge of the table. It wasn't quite an invitation. It was closer to an order. I walked over, took the glass, and sat in the chair opposite hers. We drank in silence. 2 people inside a glass box hanging 40 floors above a frozen city. After a while, Margot said, "The board wants to buy out my controlling interest." Her voice was flat without self-pity, as if she were reading a data point. I tightened my grip on the glass. "Why?" "They think I'm losing my edge. They believe expanding the health benefits and the flexible work policies is a sign of softness. A brand risk." I spoke immediately. Turnover is down 22%. Training costs have dropped enough to cover the increase in insurance. The numbers are clear. Margot looked out through the glass. They don't care about numbers when the numbers force them to admit that people are not interchangeable parts. I asked, "What did you tell them?" She turned toward me. Her pale blue eyes were cold and exhausted at the same time. "I told them that if they attempt a hostile vote, I will personally destroy the first quarter merger agreement with the European distributors and drop the stock price 40% before Monday morning." I stared at her. You would burn your own company? Margot spoke very quietly. This is my company. I built these walls. I decide who sits inside them. She took another sip. Silence returned, but this time it was thin and fragile rather than cold. Then Margot said, I was 31 when I took control of Meridian. I made a choice. Either a life or an empire. You don't get both. She looked at the glass in her hand. I chose the empire. I cut away everything that required maintenance, friends, family, attachments, hope. They were inefficiencies. I became what I needed to become in order to survive in a room full of men who wanted to watch me fail. She stopped. And it worked. I won. I said nothing. She looked at me. But when you fell asleep on my shoulder, I realized something. You were exhausted enough that your body simply shut down. You were nearly broken. Yet you were still running for something, for your mother, for the debt, for responsibility, for a dinner in a small apartment where at least one neighbor still knocked to ask if you had eaten. Her voice dropped lower. I was only tired. There was no comfort good enough for that kind of truth. I didn't tell her she was wrong. I set my glass down. The crystal made a soft sound against the table. Then I said, My turkey is probably very dry. Margot blinked. Excuse me? The turkey. I roasted it at 400 instead of 350. It will be hostilely dry. The mashed potatoes are from a box. The pie is store-bought. Mrs. Gable has already insulted the entire menu. Margot looked at me as if trying to locate the exact point where the conversation had turned. I met her eyes. You shouldn't be here. For the first time, I did not speak as an employee to a CEO. You already won the board today. The Tokyo market will open whether you watch it or not. Put the glass down, Margot. Her name sat between us like a line that had just been crossed. Margot looked at the glass in her hand, at the city, then at me. I didn't take it back. Slowly, she set the glass down beside mine. I like boxed mashed potatoes. I smiled. A real smile, steady and warm. Then your standards are lower than I thought. She stood and reached for her coat. When the elevator doors closed, the 40th floor returned to its perfect silence. But for the first time in years, the CEO did not stay behind to listen to it. I drove Margot to my apartment. Not a penthouse, not a restaurant, not any place that matched a woman who could threaten to move a stock price with a single decision. Just a small apartment with a warm kitchen light, the smell of slightly burnt turkey, boxed mashed potatoes, Mrs. Gable's cookies, and an old wooden table with room for two. Margot stood in the doorway for a long time. I realized she did not know how to step into a space that did not require her to control it. I said, You don't have to say anything intelligent. Just sit down before the turkey turns into construction material. She looked at me. Then, for the first time, Margot Tennant smiled a real smile. Not large, not completely soft, but real. And the small kitchen felt a few degrees warmer. After that Christmas night, nothing became simple. I was still a senior employee of Meridian. Margot was still the CEO. The power difference between us was real, and both of us were smart enough not to pretend it didn't exist. The morning after Christmas, Margot called Legal and Human Resources. She directed that I report to an independent operations committee rather than under her direct authority. My compensation and performance reviews were placed under separate oversight to avoid any conflict of interest. When I asked whether it needed to be that formal, she looked at me with the familiar, cool expression. I don't build a company by ignoring risk just because the risk has brown eyes and a habit of overcooking turkey, I said. That was almost romantic. Don't embarrass it. We moved slowly, very slowly. Some evenings, Margot came to my apartment after work not to discuss strategy, but to sit at the kitchen table with a bowl of Mrs. Gable's soup and the crackle of an old radio. At first, she sat with her back straight, as if she were still in a board meeting. After a few weeks, she learned to take off her heels at the door. After a few months, she knew where I kept the glasses, knew the living room heater needed a light kick to run evenly, and knew that Mrs. Gable would knock on the wall if we talked too late. Mrs. Gable was not impressed by Margot's wealth. The first time they met, she looked Margot up and down and said, You're the one who made the boy sleep again, correct? Margot answered with complete seriousness. I restructured his working conditions. Mrs. Gable gave a short hum. I call it letting him sleep. Margot was quiet for a second. Your version is shorter. From that day on, Mrs. Gable liked her. The board did not. Graham Voss and a few others still believed Margot had grown soft. They disliked the expanded health benefits, the reduced mandatory hours in the operations divisions, and the fact that she had turned human performance into a real metric in the reports. A major board meeting was called in the spring. Graham presented carefully selected numbers meant to show rising personnel costs. He told the room, "Meridian used to be a precision machine. Now we're turning into a sentimental welfare program." Margot sat at the head of the table and listened in silence. I was present as regional risk director to speak on operational impact. When it was my turn, I put a complete report on the screen. Lower turnover, fewer operational errors, reduced recruiting costs, faster crisis response times, fewer unplanned sick days. I said, even the most precise machine fails if it runs past its thermal limit. What Ms. Tennant has done is not sentiment. It is system maintenance at the human level. Graham's voice turned cold. Are you defending the policy or defending the person who advanced your career? The room went still. It was a deliberate strike. I looked at him. I'm defending the numbers. If you have a full counter data set, I'll review it. If all you have is implication, that isn't strategy, that's noise. A few people in the room lowered their heads to hide small smiles. Margot did not smile, but I saw a faint light in her eyes. In the end, the board could not overturn her policies. More shareholders began to support them because the results were too clear. Meridian had not grown weaker. The company was more stable, people stayed longer, and crises were handled better. Margot remained Margot. She did not become gentle overnight. She could still silence an entire conference room. She still delivered short sentences that forced people to rethink entire plans. She still hated vagueness, waste, and toast that had gone too dry. But she no longer lived as if she only had an empire. She began to have a place in her own life. Some Sunday mornings she arrived at my apartment with coffee that cost too much and a physical newspaper. Some nights she texted me that she had shut down her computer before 10, as if it were an athletic achievement. Once she asked whether the quiet in my place was always this comfortable. I said, no, before it was lonelier. She looked at me. And now? I answered, now it waits for someone to knock. She said nothing, but under the table she took my hand. 1 year after the flight, Meridian held the shareholder conference in Seattle again. This time, I was no longer the man on the edge of collapse. I walked into the meeting room with clear reports, my own team, and a steadiness I had not possessed before. Margot sat at the head of the table. She still wore the charcoal blazer. She still had the same pale, cold eyes. But when I began my section, she rested her hand on the edge of the table and tapped twice. A very small signal, one only I understood. I'm listening. You're all right. After the conference, the flight back to Chicago was delayed by snow. Margot and I sat side by side in first class, the same way we had a year earlier. I looked at seat 2B and said, should I sign a pledge not to fall asleep on the CEO's shoulder? Margot did not look at me. Do you sleep enough now? More than before. Then I assessed the risk as lower. I smiled. The plane lifted. Chicago disappeared into cloud behind us. The low roar of the engines filled the cabin. After a while, Margot leaned her shoulder lightly against mine. Not much, just enough for me to feel the weight of her. The woman who had built walls high enough that no one could enter them now allowed herself to lean toward another person in the gray sky. I said nothing. I simply sat still and let her rest for as long as she needed. This time, no one collapsed from exhaustion. No one mistook kindness for weakness. No one had to pretend to be a machine. And as she closed her eyes, I looked out the small window and remembered the man from a year before who had fallen asleep on her shoulder because he no longer had the strength to keep standing. I had thought that moment would destroy my life. Instead, it turned out that sometimes a person is only truly seen when the body can no longer keep up the performance. I fell asleep on the shoulder of the coldest female CEO in the company. She could have fired me with a single sentence. Instead, she saw a man who was running on empty. And over time, I saw a woman who was alone inside the empire she had built. We did not save each other like a fairy tale. We simply pulled each other out of two different kinds of cold. I out of the exhaustion of a life spent only surviving. She out of the silence of a glass tower where no one was waiting for her to come home. And perhaps that is how love begins for people who thought they no longer had time for it. Not with grand declarations, but with a shoulder, a slightly burnt dinner, a glass set down on a table, and someone finally willing to say, "Come home. There's room for you there."